steadfast in thy word. Curve those who...
The Lord be with you. Welcome to our next 316 podcast episode. Today we're covering two books, Micah and Nahum. Micah has no 316 in it. Nahum does. It's a small verse. So we're going to talk about it, and we're going to cover the book of Micah in a general way. Tried to put similar things on each side of the board for us. The overall message of Micah is that Israel is faithless. The fancy word for that is apostate. Maybe in books or journals, or if you listen to religious podcasts or sermons, maybe you've heard the word apostasy. Well, it means faithless. That's where Israel was at this time. And the time is about 700 BC. Micah and Isaiah were contemporaries, working at about the same time, kind of delivering the same message. Isaiah had messages of judgment for the nation. He also brought them the comfort and the salvation that God was bringing. Israel was faithless, and God has some words of wrath for the leaders and the prophets. The leaders weren't leading, and the prophets, well, they were prophesying, but they were giving words that suited themselves and not the people. Leaders that won't lead, not much good for anything. Now, there are different styles of leadership. You might thrive under different kinds. You know the kinds that do not suit you. So you might not be drawn to a certain kind of leader. But the leaders and the prophets, they kind of shared things. I mentioned that the prophets were prophesying for themselves, and we'll get to them in just a moment. The leaders were also leading for themselves. They were not there to suit themselves. They were leaders to lead God's people, but they weren't doing that. The prophets, they were prophesying to enrich themselves, to make themselves popular. And what happened in 700 BC? Well, has it really changed? Do we know leaders in our family, in a church, in a job, in a state or national level? Do we know leaders who are only interested in themselves, who lead to make a name for themselves? We probably do know leaders like that. Prophets. Ezekiel, the Old Testament prophet, he warned of shepherds who, instead of gathering the flock to themselves, were scattering the flock. Prophets who were not giving a word of warning to those who were sinning. Right? Speak to those people and warn them. If they don't listen, hey, that's their issue, but at least you warned them. But if you don't warn them, they're going to die for their sin, and you are going to be punished because you said nothing when I told you to say something. In the New Testament time, Paul was talking about prophets or pastors, teachers who only itch your ears, tickle your ears, tell you what you want to hear. Maybe direct all your attention on them, how bad they are. They should really get punished. They are no good. They're rotten. You need to hear that message too. God's call is for us to repent and believe the good news. But we still have false prophets in our day, false teachers, leaders who only lead for themselves. It's a warning for us. Let's turn our attention to Nahum. This does have a 3:16 in it. The overall theme is that Yahweh, and just for a reminder, those big 4 letters, that's the name of the Lord. You know his name. We can call upon that name in every prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. Yahweh fights for those who take refuge in him. Almost kind of sounds like Psalm 46. A mighty fortress is our God, a trusty refuge. Yahweh fights for those who take refuge in him. We're roughly the year 620 BC, not too far removed from Micah. And it's a message really directed to Nineveh. And it's a book, 3 chapters of woe to Nineveh. When we get to 3:16, we're going to see that they have merchants that are greater than the stars in the heaven. Why is God going after Nineveh? Here's a little map that I put on our board for us. Here's Israel right in the middle. In the middle of what? Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. That's an uncomfortable spot to be. Babylon doesn't like Egypt. Babylon doesn't like Assyria. Assyria doesn't like Egypt. Assyria doesn't like Babylon. Egypt doesn't like Assyria, and Egypt doesn't like Babylon. So, if you're the king, how are you going to get to Assyria to fight them? How are you going to get to Babylon to fight them? You got to go right through Israel, and vice versa. It's an uncomfortable spot to be in. And at various times, Egypt was number 1. And then for a while, it'd be Babylon. And for a while, it would be the Assyrians. You know who was never number 1? These people right here. Maybe during the time of David, they were the strongest. And under Solomon, they were pretty sizable. But for the majority of the time, Israel wasn't much. There wasn't anything really there. Just a strange group of people who did not worship all the other false gods that were around them. And there were a whole lot of other nations and nation states around Israel. But these were the big 3, Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. And what Israel would often do is they would try to buy friendship. Don't attack us. Here is all of our money. And that would work for a little while until the other nation said, hey, we need more money. Let's get it from Israel. And Israel said, we don't have any more money. Or Assyria would find out, Israel was on Assyria's side, but now Israel was trying to cozy up to Egypt. You double-crossed us. and then they'd pound them. God's people were trying to be faithful, but God knew also how the bullies were behaving. And so God now preaches woe to Nineveh. This is chapter 3. Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey. The crack of the whip and rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and bounding chariot. It goes on for several more verses about the might of Nineveh and how might can be used to get your way. Again, kind of a bully, using your might and a closed fist to force people to do what you want to do. If we had just spent some time talking about leadership, this can be effective leadership for a while, until that's all you have. And if this is all you have, you don't have much. Let's look at our 3:16. And he's talking, the Lord, or Nahum, is speaking the Lord's words to Nineveh. You increased your merchants more than the stars of the heavens. The locust spreads its wings and flies away. God's not saying that it's wrong to be a merchant, to have a business, to have an entrepreneurial spirit. But Nineveh had more merchants than there were stars in the sky. That's a lot of merchants. And it was not uncommon for the merchants to collude together, to have dishonest scales, right? You go in to buy a pound of flour, and they would have a scale and a weight on there. And it would read, we'll just use our understanding, 16 ounces, when really it was 14 ounces, a dishonest weight. So you wouldn't know that it was dishonest. So they'd scoop the flour on there, and you'd get a pound of flour. You'd pay for a pound, and you'd leave with 14 ounces. Theft. That's all that it is. Theft. Or at the end of the day, you'd sweep up your store. You have a bunch of flour on the floor. I can resell that. It's also on the floor, dirt. So let me sell you a pound of flour that also has dirt in it. Theft. Dishonesty. Woe to Nineveh. You're more interested in the merchants and making sure they're taken care of. Yahweh fights for those who take refuge in him. We take refuge in the Lord, seeking honesty from the people we deal with, fairness. And I know the world isn't fair. Doesn't mean we shouldn't seek it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't seek to treat one another with fairness. We remember that the Lord has called to us. The Lord has sent prophets to us to talk about how we should live in honesty with one another. That the Lord cares for his people. 2 more books accomplished today. We'll move on in our next podcast episode to see what the Lord has to say to us again. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
evermore